what I am here to talk to you about today is really about partnering with sales and marketing. And there's kind of an IT flow through this and a communications bent, but this is really, it goes to the heart of probably two of the most difficult relationships that you can experience or work with inside of an organization. And some of the learnings that we've had over a period of time to make this a little smoother. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but it's certainly a little smoother. It's the sales and marketing group, an incredibly contentious relationship. Or being the marketing guy, I like to call it the marketing and sales group. See what I did there? Okay, it's early. Or you were out late, whichever. Whole point being that when this is working well, it's felt throughout the entire company. And conversely, when it's not working well, this is probably one of the most impactful and destructive relationships functionally that a company can have. Ironically, as it's centered around the very lifeblood that we depend on, the revenue. We're also starting to see a trend towards, because this is such a problem, of putting this together underneath one department. Chief Revenue Officer is a typical title that we're currently seeing, as if that's somehow going to magically fix it. So regardless of which financial clock you're on, you've got these two different organizations dealing with essentially the same problem, the customer interaction point. Throw service and support in there, and you've probably got every single touch point that a company has with a customer. Just button heads. Everybody knows you can't leave the marketing leader and the sales leader in the same room for any length of time with sharp objects. Not going to happen. You're going to need lawyers at some point. But why? I mean, these are two that have got a common goal. Their interests, you would think, would somewhere align along the way, and yet continually, time after time, it is just an incredibly contentious relationship. So I asked the marketeers, how do you actually see sales? God, the list I got. Needy, self-absorbed, power-hungry, territorial, and if there are any sales guys in the room, don't leave just yet. I'll bring this back around, don't worry. Needy, territorial, suddenly disappearing off for customer meetings, just can't seem to stick to any agenda, attention deficit. These were all things that were used to describe the sales guys. And someone else commented, they said, you know what, 40 to 70% of the sales process is complete before a salesperson even speaks to the account. 40 to 70%. And it's marketing that does that. All these guys do is hang around at the end, pick up the order, get the gratuitous slap on the backs, it's wonderful, and they disappear off into the sunset. Now, the point isn't whether it's 40 or 70% that some analyst somewhere claimed was accurate. The point is that the number's large. And there's a feeling in the marketing organization that somehow they should get the credit for that. There should be some kind of remuneration, recognition. So I went to the sales guys and asked the same kind of thing. So for the sales guys, it's a slightly different list, but it had a similar theme to it. They resent us. They resent the long vendor lunches, the multi-million-dollar budgets, the organizing the partner conferences, which to them are always great fun, or the sales meetings always great fun. By the way, as a sideline, if you think those things are great fun and you've got a rock band that's actually going to be at the show, negotiating with a rock band is quite possibly one of the worst things you can possibly do. Found myself debating which kind of vodka was actually going to be in their dressing room, and that's just not a place you want to be in. But they were getting irritated by it. It was, as far as they were concerned, we were an expense. They were spending that very lifeblood, the revenue, the cash flow, etc., that the company has. They would rather that we just said thank you and went on our way. They see us as idealistic, talking about things like click-through rates, CTR, and minimal, meaningless numbers like a 1.7532% click-through rate, as if it's something good. they hear us talking about thought leadership. And my favorite quote was, thought leadership, show me on this price list where there's a part number for thought leadership and I'll listen to you. Actually came from a sales guy. But kind of gives you that concept and that idea of how these two groups are really thinking about each other. The reality is, when you kind of went through, okay, you've given me a broad brush description of what a salesperson is or a marketing person is. Now, name one person in the organization that is actually that stereotype. Room goes quiet. And the reality is, we are dealing with these preconceived ideas about the individuals that we're going to interact with. It gets in the way of the relationships we have. The trend I spoke about earlier of the chief revenue officer, I speak to a lot of the guys that have, and girls that have taken on this particular role, and they talk about how it's stifling creativity. Instead of fixing that alignment, what you've actually done is place somebody at the top of it, so now both groups can go to Dad and ask for what's the right answer. There is little alignment based around that. It actually seems to exacerbate the situation. Now, as marketeers, we spend an awful lot of time thinking through personas. And if you've worked with a marketing group or you're in a marketing group, you'll know what I mean. We kind of come up with these concepts and ideas of people. They're imaginary, they've got real names, but we think about how they interact, where they go and talk with peers, where they go and find information, how they learn, what's required to move them from one stage to the next. We think about backup plans. If you've ever seen one of these charts, it actually looks like the plumbing for a small country by the time you've actually gone through the flow chart for it. And yet, we then turn around to our sales partners. We bypass all of this thinking. We give them a sales presentation and a rather questionable set of leads and say, go get some revenue. That's why. There's been a lot of thinking in the industry, and you see a lot of structure around this MQL concept. And if you're not familiar with it, it refers to a marketing qualified lead. Sales qualified lead, sales accepted lead, running into the sales process. If you're not thinking in these concepts, you probably want to get underneath this and at least understand what that flow is. But the handoff point is an MQL, a marketing qualified lead. That's where my responsibility as a marketeer stops and the sales responsibility picks up. It's a clear, defined handover. It's good, it's measurable, it's understandable, it's one big metric. And it is probably the one reason that today we have such contentious relationships, because we view it as linear. I kind of had a turning point in this, and it was a meeting with with a marketing agency, and I had the sales leader there, and at the beginning of this meeting, we were talking about PR, and that's fine. The sales guy can stay in the meeting about PR, because who cares, right? We're going to do some press releases, trying to make him or her famous anyway, so it's all about them. You can stay and listen. Now, if you're not aware, as a marketeer, my one job is to get the sales guy out of that meeting once the PR part is finished. You don't want to allow them into the secret sauce of how things actually work, why we're doing things, how campaigns are structured. That would be an absolute catastrophe, is the prevalent thinking at the moment. But what actually happened, I kind of looked over at him, and I'm sending him those signals of like, dude, what are you doing here? You got to get up, you got to get out. You know, this is the marketing part. Got to go sell something, call a customer, whatever your emergency 9 holes of golf, whatever it is that you typically do to get out of a meeting that you don't want to be in. Now's the time to do it. Come on, get out. He just looked at me and said, I don't know where to go. I'm going to hang out and see what you guys do. Oh, crap. So now we sit and we go through some of the campaign planning and what we're doing in terms of asset creation and what are the tools that are required for this campaign to actually work. What are the varying touch points, how it flows. What are the nuts and bolts of how we actually do marketing and generate those leads. Now, to be fair, the salesperson didn't say anything insightful. I mean, after all, frankly, why would he? It was the first time he was hearing it. But what it did do was give an insight into some of the difficulties that we deal with day in, day out. But more importantly, he had a whole bunch of suggestions for how we could engage further down the sales process. It actually broke through that handoff of the MQL. that it's now your problem. I'm giving you the problem, is typically what I'm saying with the MQL. And he's saying, I'll accept that problem and go try sell something. Now, everyone's seen one of these funnels. They're nice and they're neat, and they kind of fall down in a nice flow, and you see them in all sorts of CRM packages out there. And there are varying descriptions of what these are, whether I've just put pre-aware, aware consideration. You can use ADA. If you've had a consultant in your company recently, you've probably got a version of this that's got 19 different levels, all with subtle nuances that are very, very difficult to figure out which layer is at which. But nonetheless, we describe this in a nice, neat funnel. Because it makes sense. It makes intuitive sense. It's linear, simple, completely unrealistic. If you actually take a look at all of the pipeline opportunity, it looks like kind of a middle-aged person. It's smarter at the top. We know more about the individuals that are at the beginning of this pipeline. It's kind of bloated in the middle. It's got that middle-aged spread where things just kind of sit and you can't move them on or get rid of them. And some of that stuff actually flows down to being a customer. The reality is a lot more complicated, in particular as you start to look at the top end of the funnel. And there are a whole series of connections that are drawn in between, for example, product sheets, social media, blogs, rate insights, what we're doing in terms of press releases, how that works with SEO, website, how that interacts there. Essentially, all of these things are interconnected, and there isn't a single buyer out there that ever walks through a nice, neat, linear flow from original idea and concept all the way through to sale. And regardless of what we like to tell you as B2B marketeers, they are all emotional purchases. I'll bet there isn't one person in this room that has had complete buying decision control from start to bottom that has suddenly paused to go, wait a minute, what's the ROI or TCO on this particular decision? When you own the decision and you can make it, you make it. You use arguments like TCO and ROI when you have to influence somebody else. And that's a key, important point to the overall alignment with sales and marketing. The sales guy didn't necessarily process that, certainly not in the way that we've been presenting it, and certainly not based around this artificial handoff of here's an MQL, my job's done. The other thing was breaking through this agenda suspicion. I mean, how many times, and I did this with my own team, when you walk into a meeting with the salesperson, what's going through your mind? And it was typically, God, what's this ambush about? How many versions of all the leads I give you suck am I going to hear over the next 30 minutes? I know there's something bad that's... The point is, it was trepidation. It was, I'm not comfortable going into this. It wasn't approached from the right perspective. Asking the sales team the same question, it was exactly the same kind of approach. How many excuses are we going to hear about why we can't find the right kind of customer for me to sell to? Very, very insular and narrow in thinking. So what came out of this was 9 learnings. And we are in the process of implementing this throughout ShoreTel. Some are cultural, some are common sense, and some are founded in technology and making sure that you've got the right touch points between sales and marketing for things to happen. So the first was, and originally we had 10, by the way, but somebody pointed out that 10 Commandments probably wasn't a good idea, is it? So anyway, we went to 9, smashed one of them. First one, you can lead from the front, but celebrate from the rear. This one is for the marketing guys. Again, going back to that persona, when you look at sales, part of that culture, part of that reinforcement of the positive behavior is that celebration part. When they're busy celebrating about a great opportunity that they just closed, that is not the time to be reminding them that that lead came from some esoteric campaign that some marketeer did. And by the way, 40 to 70% of it was done before you even spoke to the customer. Wrong timing, wrong place. You have to go back to thinking about the personas and the individuals involved. And the key point is the sales leader has very, very different requirements and is dealing with very different issues. He or she is dealing with issues of motivation, of focus, of just continually trying to drive that number home. So you can lead it from the front. Here's the campaigns. Here's what we're doing. But when the celebrations are happening, you do not want to be front and center. A seasoned sales leader knows what happened. You get the kudos anyway. The next one was, look, when interests align, it's much easier to drive alignment. Now that sounds like the dumbest of all statements. And yet this is the one that's most overlooked. Again, we get too focused on our own issues, on our own functional requirements. I've yet to meet a salesperson that really wants to get into a conversation about how that call to action button on the website has suddenly gone from this number to that number because we changed it from red to blue. They simply don't care. That's kind of one of those functional requirements, not a topic for the salespeople. They care about the outcome. You have to tailor the message. And probably the other important part is getting away from the secrets. There is no value whatsoever in the information itself. The value is in the analysis. And typically, when you get the smart people around the table to look at it, you'll come up with insights. Another one, I never learn very much when I'm speaking. I wish I could find out who to attribute this one to, and this one has become somewhat of a mantra inside ShoreTel, to the point where the other day we had a meeting and they were talking over each other. Somebody pointed out that we never learn very much when we're speaking. Whole room went quiet. Law of unintended consequences there, and with that, I'll shut up and move on. Adopting best practices in agency and campaign management. And by this, I don't mean go take a look at whatever the latest research is. The point is, adopt the best practices for you. And what really worked for us, what's working incredibly well, is to have rotation of some of the sales leadership through that early part of the marketing process. Through that part where we're actually looking at the campaign creation, what we're looking at from a website, a touch point perspective, getting as much of that thinking as we can, because the sales guys are actually the people that are dealing with the customers, with the real human beings. The worst part when you get a group of marketeers together is they sit around the table and MSU happens. They make stuff up. And worse, they believe it. Unless you can validate it, unless you know that's what's going on, you're not being intellectually honest with yourselves and your campaigns. They won't work as well. Having a salesperson in the conversation really helps. Now, conversely, having a marketeer close when it's towards the end of the sale, that either 60 to 30%, depending on who you believe, is this dying on me or keeps cutting out? Okay. That 30 to 60%, depending on which set of reading you believe, having a marketeer in that part of the process, arguably the most important part of the sales process, is critical. They can then get those understandings and those messages and build them into the next campaign, so it's a lot more effective. This was an interesting one. The is at the same rate. By that, what I mean is, look, you got some people grew up next to power lines. They paint chips when they were a kid. They're kind of a little slower than others. And you got some that were brilliant and prodigy, and typically they got the trophies still in the cube to point that out to you, or they've pasted their IQ on Facebook, something like that. My point is, rather than insulting the extremes, is that you've got a broad spectrum of people, a broad spectrum of their ability to process an idea or a concept, and not everybody moves at the same pace. And it took a while for us to internalize this particular idea, because while we all kind of get that people move at different speeds, it's difficult to actually work with that. So my mother's a psychologist. My other half is a psychologist. Her mother's a psychologist. I get a lot of free advice on psychology. We actually looked at some of the psychometric tools that are out there to assess how we behaved as team members and what that interaction was. I kind of go home and I talk through these concepts and I butcher them completely. Actually, the only good part about that is there's no copay for the sessions I get at home, but I get lots of them. We actually looked at a tool called Berkman. And by the way, I am not advocating for using Berkman. This is just one of many, many tools out there. I like it because it's simple. It's got a nice little 2x2 cube, and it's colorful, and it looks good on a slide for me, and I can explain it quickly and easily. The point is that as individuals, we have pre-configured areas where we're comfortable. And we have a work requirement, a home requirement, and just an area in general where we feel comfortable dealing with ideas. You take the test, and it will put you in one of these quadrants. Now, as I said earlier, I probably butchered these principles. If any of you are trained in using this, I apologize up front. But for me, I found that it was a very simple, easy map to look at the way that people processed ideas. And then it struck me that this is actually the way that an idea or a concept is actually driven through a company. We start with an idea, we work through the process, we spend some time trying to influence people, and then we get into this action phase. Kind of the curious thing is, has anybody ever been in the situation where you've gone through, here's a great idea, and I bet there's a product or person or two in the audience that has had this, here's a great idea, we've done all the research, what we need to do now is introduce this into the marketplace, and I cannot understand for the life of me why you don't get this idea. Bottom line is, you haven't given them time. You didn't give them time to think about the idea to begin with, to think about the processes that were required to introduce it, what was actually needed to reach out to the customer, who else in the organization did we need to influence, who do we need to influence in the market for them to accept this as a popular thing, right, now we're ready, let's go do something. And you quite often find there are people all the way over in the red with a great idea saying, let's do, let's do, let's do, nobody's following. Taking this kind of approach changed the way fundamentally that the sales and marketing team work together. We spent time going through this. We shared the maps with each other. You'll actually hear the language of, wait a minute, you're all the way in the red at the moment, i.e. action, let's go do, let's go do. I'm all the way back in the blue. I'm still trying to figure out what the heck the idea is that you're trying to put on the table. Taking this gives you a nice, simple map to have those interactions in a sensible fashion and take some of the heat out of the entire debate. Next one is organize around the buyer and not the organization. And what I mean by this is quite often when you hear about problems with sales and marketing alignment, the immediate answer is, we need a chief revenue officer and we'll make them both report to that person, that individual. Now, I'm not advocating for don't do that, and I'm not advocating for do it. What I am saying is think about the buyer first. Think about the customer first. There's never been a single instance of a customer that's out there that has said, you know what? That was a great organization that sold this thing to me. They don't care. They care about the messages. They care about the way you interact. They care about it being frictionless and seamless. Think about the customer, not the organization first, and organize around the customer. Here's an interesting one from a marketeer. It's not about digital marketing. It's about marketing and selling in a digital world. Sounds like heresy from a marketeer. But what I mean by this is, look, the sales guys do not sell in a digital world. They sell in a real world. You're here at trade shows. Still a very, very important part of that overall interaction. What you have to do as a sales and marketing team is provide the ability to have those interactions in the real world with a digital context. An example, you're out on the golf course, they're busy checking their scores or whatever, it's an important customer meeting. If you're serving up mobile ads, which you can do right now, and it happens to show up on whatever application that is at the time that it's happening, it aids the salesperson with the conversation because you're present, you look bigger than you actually are. Think about those interactions in a real world with a digital bent. Another interesting one, real quick, it's not about the importance of the thing, but the importance of the people looking at the thing. This is what explains that buzz topic. The fact that one of the most popular videos of all time on YouTube is a talking dog. The honey maple kind? You've all seen it. If you haven't, you're going to go look for it afterwards. There's nothing really of intrinsic value in that video whatsoever. It's kind of mildly amusing. What became important was how many people were looking at it. So it's not the importance of the thing, it's the importance of the people looking at the thing. Changing your thinking as a sales and marketing team around that simple concept really changes the kind of content that's created over time. And finally, this one holds true. There are actually 22 immutable laws of marketing as per the book. There should be 23. This should be the 23rd. Now, it takes 10 units of positive stuff to refute 1 unit of negative stuff, i.e. the amount of effort required to refute bullshit is inordinately higher than it is to create it. And if you think I'm wrong, go prove me wrong. It's going to take you 10 times the effort to, I just said it's true, and so therefore it's true. Point being, take a look at what's fertilizing the fertilizer. Within an organization, you'll often have a fact or a statistic. This doesn't work because. Instead of immediately trying to refute it, get into the bottom of why it doesn't work. I think it was Mark Cuban that said, shorts are your friend. He was talking about being a public company and the fact that when you get shorts on your stock, we tend to worry about that if you're public. But the reality is, they're giving you an indication of where you're going wrong. His point was, embrace the detractors, understand what they're saying, get underneath it, fix the problems, celebrate the response. So, in short, what I'm advocating for is just a simple, transparent approach, making the dashboards available to both sides, agreeing a common set of stats, and this is where the technology plays in. It's more than just an MQL, much, much more than an MQL. And in looking at the buyer's journey of it doesn't start with marketing and finish with marketing, it's probably a sliding scale all the way up and down. With that, thank you.